guys. In this lecture, I want to talk about Colossians. And our primary entryway into Colossians for this week is going to be the Colossian Christ hymn in chapter 1, verses 15 to 20. But a little bit about Colossae before we get started on that. Colossae was really a kind of small town. In Nevada, we would call it a podunk sort of town. It really wasn't as prominent as some of the other cities in the Lycaonian Valley in Asia Minor. For example, Laodicea and Ephesus. But what is most distressing about Colossae for Colossian scholars and Ephesian scholars is the fact that Colossae has not been excavated. It's an unexcavated tell. It's just a mount, a little hill with who knows what buried underneath it. And for whatever reason, I think there are some legal reasons, but it just has not been excavated. And Colossian scholars always joke that our commentaries will have to be rewritten once the tell is finally excavated. So it's very tantalizing, and unfortunately we can't say much about Colossae for this reason. Now, Paul didn't know the church directly. We see several signs of that throughout the letter, but he's written to them anyways, and it's very interesting, I think, to look at the hymn as a kind of entryway into discerning what he was primarily concerned about when he was writing to them. Now, I've used the language of hymn very similar to Philippians 2. What we have here is potentially a hymn that was utilized by Paul, something that the early church had written for liturgical purposes, worship to Christ, that we again, see here in Colossians. Now, similarly to last time with Philippians 2, there is some debate as to whether Paul made use of a pre-existing hymn, or if Paul composed it himself. It's possible that Paul composed it himself, that he wrote it. But regardless of whether or not he wrote it, again, nobody denies that he is making good use of it and that he affirms it, and that our primary interest is seeing how this hymn functions in its Colossian epistolary context. That is our primary focus, and so we want to see how Paul has interpreted it if he hasn't actually written it himself. So that's going to be really important for us. What's also similar about the comparison here with Philippians 2 and Colossians 1 is that there seems to be a potentially a covert critique of Caesar. Just as we saw last time with the Philippians 2 example, there may be some covert imperial criticism going on, and I want to suggest that something is also very possibly going on here as well. Now, the primary approach to this passage is not to understand it in terms of a kind of imperial critique, or really to see it as really bearing much regality at all. The primary interpretation is that really this is a hymn to Christ as sort of a wisdom embodied, that this is really to be understood as drawing upon traditions related to wisdom. This is the main approach to the Colossian hymn. This is how most scholars understand it. In fact, when you dive into literature, you'll see that not only is this how most scholars understand it, but it's sort of taken for granted in a lot of ways that this is surely the background and that this is informative. And most scholars act as if it's basically a done deal. And within Colossians, there are indeed themes related to wisdom. You can see that throughout Colossians. There are references to growing in knowledge and wisdom, and that is surely there. But it's where this idea really comes from is from a couple of key passages like Proverbs 8, Sirach 24, which is part of the Apocrypha for Protestants, the wisdom of Solomon, again part of the Apocrypha, and from some of the writings of Philo. And within these texts, wisdom is sort of personified as this, being through which God created everything. And so the obvious connections in this Colossian passage to Christ creating all things, draws the attention of a lot of people. But it goes beyond that, because a lot of the terminology has some interesting overlap with what we see in the hymn. And so scholars say, the background for this is how Second Temple Jews talked about wisdom. And so now what we see is that wisdom in these texts and in Second Temple Jewish thought is understood to be embodied in Christ. That's how most scholars understand this. And so what I want to do, without getting into all the details for why the wisdom traditions have been seen to be so prominent, and you can see that in the literature if you're interested, but I want to propose an alternate proposal. A little bit on my own on this in proposing it, but what I want to suggest is that regal concerns best explain what's going on as opposed to wisdom traditions. So I doubt the influence of wisdom in this passage, though I do recognize that the tradition of Christ creating all things is very reminiscent of these wisdom traditions. And I don't want to overstate the case in such a way that suggests that wisdom themes and regal themes don't clearly intersect and even overlap in the literature. For example, kings needed wisdom to rule appropriately. You think about the Solomonic traditions, which clearly combined regality and wisdom together. So I don't want to overstate this. I just think that regal background best explains what we see going on. This was actually the very first publication that I ever had. Was I wrote an article on this passage arguing that regal themes best explain it as opposed to wisdom traditions. And so I'll sort of summarize that article and then also let you know a little bit about some of the reception of these ideas since I've published it. But the important thing to know is that what I am suggesting is, definitely a minority opinion, that scholars primarily understand this passage in terms of wisdom. But I want to offer a case for you all that really regal themes are more prominent. Okay, so before we look at the hymn itself, let's think about the context in which it is placed and the immediate context. What do we see? Well, as we're sort of building up to the hymn, there are several allusions to Genesis and the command to be fruitful and multiply. We see this in chapter 1 verse 6 and in chapter 1 verse 10. There's this language of being fruitful and growing, which is reminiscent of the being fruitful and multiplying. So there are these references that seem to evoke that commission in Genesis 1 of being fruitful and multiplying. That I think is important. And in the immediately preceding context, looking at verses 13 and 14, it's very interesting to see what's said about Jesus here. It says that God has rescued us from the power of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. So right before we get this hymn, we are made aware of this transference from one kingdom to another. And the king of that kingdom is God's beloved Son, and in him we have redemption and we have forgiveness of sins. This language of sonship highlights his regal role. Throughout the Old Testament, Israel was called the children of God, or could be called a son of God. And similarly, kings were especially known to be sons of God in this regal sense. It's very, very prominent language throughout the Old Testament. So to speak of Christ as son highlights this regal regal role. And of course, to say the kingdom of, God's beloved Son, that is to obviously further highlight this regal connotation. Now let's look at the hymn. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read the whole passage, verses 15 to 20, and then we're going to work through it carefully, noting some of the key terminology that we see here. And I also want to make some reference to the clauses and how I've subordinated the text to further prepare us for our assignment on the epistolary logical analysis. Okay, so first I will read verses 15 to 20. And I'm not going to be reading my own translation of the Greek. I will comment on this translation, which is a common translation of a couple of key terms, and I will note some places where I differ with the standard translations. All right, let's go ahead and read this. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Now that's the text which we're calling the Colossian Christ hymn. Now I want to first mention some issues of subordination and coordination here with the clauses. I see two primary statements being made, and everything else is subordinated to those statements. The first statement is, he is the image of the invisible God. Okay, at the very beginning of verse 15. The next major statement actually comes in the middle of verse 18, usually translated as, he is the beginning. Okay. Now, the reason why I see those as the two main statements is because they both begin with a parallel structure in the Greek. It's easy to see it a little bit in English with the he is the, but that sort of gets muddled in some other places, whereas in the Greek it's very clear because there's a prominent relative pronoun. We don't need to get into the grammar of it, but it's very clear that you sort of have two stanzas that begin with he is the image of the invisible God, and then further down, he is the beginning. One of the ways that we can see how this is correct is notice the language of firstborn, which appears twice, and that term appears twice after those two lines, which I've identified as being the two main ones. So he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, and then going down to the next major line, he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. Okay, and so then everything else within the hymn is sort of subordinated to those clauses, and then further clauses as we go on. And I won't get into all of this here, but I see that as being really really important, and I'll comment on some of that. Now let's look at some of the key terms here. So first one actually is just that pronoun, he. As I mentioned in the Greek, it's a relative pronoun, which we would translate normally as who. This who we have to ask, who to whom does the who refer, right? Well, in context, we've just heard about this beloved Son who has a kingdom, right? And in him we have forgiveness of sins and redemption and all of that. The he is referring to a regal figure. The who, if we didn't translate it as he, who as a relative pronoun is referring to this regal figure, this beloved Son who is the king of a kingdom. Okay, so I see that as really, really crucial to start. Who are we talking about? We're talking about a regal figure. And as we carry on, we're told that this regal figure is the image of the invisible God. Now, there's a lot to comment on here. This is a very rich term, icon. This is surely reminiscent of Genesis 1, right? That man and woman were created in the image of God, right? And as I've noted already, there are clear allusions to Genesis 1 with the bearing fruit and growing twice repeated in chapter 1 as we are building towards this reference here to Christ being the image of the invisible God. So I think that's really important. And I think when we look at the nature of image bearing in Genesis 1, it's about ruling and subduing. That's what it's about. It's about ruling and subduing. In the ancient Near Eastern context, kings would put up images of themselves wherever their rule extended as a way of saying, I rule even in this place. And in my absence, you can tell that I am, ruling over this because you have this prominent image of me that declares that I rule this place. I rule over this. And that's what we see in Genesis 1. When God created everything and he put Adam and Eve in the garden, they were meant to rule on God's behalf, right? By placing image bearers in the garden, it was a way of saying, I rule over this. It's a way for God to say that. I rule over this. And humans were commissioned to rule on God's behalf, to rule and subdue over the rest of creation. Okay? And so I think that image connotation is very, very crucial for our passage here. But what's even more interesting about this is it's not that Christ is like Adam, but rather that Adam was like Christ. Because what we see in this passage is that he was the image of the invisible God before creation. He's the one who created everything. That means that he was the image prior to Adam bearing the image, and that Christ was made in according to the image which is Christ. And so Christ being this regal figure is the way that we are supposed to see Adam and Eve as this as these regal figures in the garden. So it doesn't mean that Christ is like Adam. Adam was like Christ. That I think is an interesting and important connotation. Now, he was the image of the invisible God prior to creation. But he images God, right, in his humanity to us. He displays Christ as John says, he exegetes the Father, right? That's really, really important and crucial. This language of being the image of the invisible God, I think, highlights the incarnation, because you can't see this invisible God, but Christ images him to us. And so I think that there is an important incarnational component to this. Now, it's going to go on to talk about how he created all things. So in what sense is this true? Well, I think it's sort of like saying, for example, that, when the president was 5 years old, ... Okay, the president wasn't the president when he was 5 years old, or, whoever we may be talking about. That person became the president later on. And so there's continuity of person, so we can refer to when the president was 5 years old, even though as a 5-year-old that person was not the president. I think there is something similar going on here where to use theological language, what Christ was in eschatology, he always was in protology. In other words, what Christ is, in his incarnation and in this sort of, restoration of humanity, being God and all that, he was always God. He was always the image of this invisible God. So there is this before all things and at the end of all things continuity. I think that's part of what we are to see here. But notice how the image of the invisible God is further sort of explained by this language of firstborn, the firstborn of all creation. Job's witnesses and some other folks want to see firstborn of all creation as a way of saying that Christ was basically the first created thing. He was the first archangel or the first, this or that. Firstborn really has a regal sense to it that is undermined by this understanding of being first created thing. The idea of being a firstborn, for example, is within ancient cultures an important sort of position of primacy within the household. But for example, in Psalm 89, it's very clearly a regal idea. Being made the firstborn is the language that's used in one line, and then the parallelism is the head of the kings of the earth. The idea of firstborn has this sort of primacy in a regal sense as well. Now, firstborn of all creation, if this meant that Christ was the first created thing, it would not make sense of the passage, because as the text is very adamant about, Christ created all things. All things is such a repetitious term here in the passage. All things, all things, all things. If Christ created all things, then by definition, he's not a thing. And so, consequently, I think the translation, the firstborn of all creation, is not the most helpful, because I think it misses an important nuance here. The firstborn of all creation is not actually how the Greek works here. There is no Greek word for of. This is what's known as the genitive case. And so it's a question of, okay, what kind of genitive is this? And so when we translate it as the firstborn of all creation, we're not really communicating much. We have to actually ask, what does of mean? Right? We do this with other phrases. For example, if I say land of Israel, I mean the land that is Israel. If I say ball of rubber, that I mean a ball made of rubber or composed of rubber. And so of doesn't mean the same thing in those two examples. It's actually very ambiguous and vague, and we have to unpack it. And here, for Christ to be called the firstborn of creation, what do we mean by that? Well, this is what would be called a genitive of subordination, that he is the firstborn over all creation because of that regal import of being firstborn. And again, this is subordinated to the idea that he is the image of the invisible God, right? And this is all telling us about the beloved Son, who is the king of a kingdom that we heard about in the verses preceding the hymn. I think that's really crucial. Now, carrying on, we get multiple, references to how Christ created all things and specifying what things, right? For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Okay, all of that, I see the main idea within that is, for by him all things were created. And then everything else we just read is in some way subordinated and modifying that in my view. Then we get another line, and he is the head of the body, the church. I see this as being an additional expansion upon what it means for Christ to be the image of the invisible God. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, and he is the head of the body, the church. Everything else was sort of subordinated to the idea of being firstborn of all creation. He is the head of the body, the church. So I want to comment on this term head, kephale, in the Greek. Within some circles and within certain debates, this term comes up a lot. For example, with the debate about complementarianism and egalitarianism, the question of women in ministry, this term comes up quite a bit. This term kephale, and there is a debate about whether it means authority or whether it means something like source. And there's a lot of back and forth there. And I just want to say that as a metaphor, right? Because if it's not anatomically referring to somebody's head, it's a metaphorical use. I think as a metaphor, we have to be open to it meaning different things in different places. That's just a blanket statement. And then also, we have to, I think, not bring the debate about women in ministry into every use of the passage. We have to understand it in its own context. And of course, the question of women in ministry is not a concern of the passage itself. So what does this term kephale mean here in context? Well, I think in light of the way that firstborn is regal and telling us more about him being the image and all of that, I see this language of kephale also having a connotation of authority. Okay, not necessarily excluding the connotation of source, but I do think the connotation of authority is there. He is the head of the body, the church. Okay, he's the creator of all things. He's the firstborn over it, right? He's the image of the invisible God, and he is the head of the church. He is the ruler of the church, I think, is one way that we could sort of understand that. And that's interesting for us to think about. So how is this term kephale used elsewhere in Colossians? Well, in chapter 2, we get 2 additional uses of it. And you'll notice that they're not the same. They're very different, actually. Looking at chapter 2, beginning in verse 9, and then looking at verse 10. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. That's a nice little echo of the hymn with the language that we see in verse 19. And you have come to fullness in him who is the head of every ruler and authority. Christ is the head of every ruler and authority. Well, the terms there, arche and exousia, and in the plural archai and exousiai, those Greek terms together in Colossians and in Ephesians consistently refer to demonic beings and demonic spirits. And so what does it mean for Christ to be the head of these? Source would be a disastrous way to understand that. There has to be some sense of rule over them, that they are sort of subjugated by him. I think that's really important, and we're going to look at a passage that explicitly talks about Christ's subjugation of them later on. But it's important to see that kephale there cannot mean source, and the use of the metaphor clearly has some connotation of authority over, and in this case, I would say even subjugation. But now looking at 2:19, this is a very different use of the metaphor. Okay, looking at verse 19, then this is sort of breaking in the middle of a sentence, and not holding fast to the head. This is Christ, from whom the whole body, nourished and held together by its ligaments and sinews, grows with a growth that is from God. Very clearly a connotation of source. I don't think authority over is ruled out, but clearly where's the emphasis? Well, it's very very obviously related to source, right? The whole body grows and is held together from this, nourished and all of that, and this ligament, and references to ligaments and sinews. Very clearly a connotation of source. Okay, so I think we have to understand the metaphor in context, and I would say in the hymn here, there is an emphasis on authority, so that it really carries on this regal connotation. So now that's the first sort of stanza or paragraph here within the hymn as I see it. The next section begins with "He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead," and then we'll look at the rest. But first thing I want to say is that I actually disagree with the way that this is typically translated. It's typically translated as I read, he is the beginning. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. The word there is arche. The word there is arche. And you'll note that I've referenced the arche and the archai in the plural a few times, and those refer to rulers. The Greek word arche can mean beginning, and it can mean ruler. And so context is going to be crucial for that. Well, in the context of this hymn, you'll notice where it says that he created all things in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. That word rulers there, that comes from this same word. Okay, these rulers are part of these, demonic evil spirits. So when it says that he is arche, I don't think that we should see this as the beginning. Of course, in context, there are references to he is before all things and he created all things. So in a way that makes sense. But to say that a person is the beginning, I think is a little odd. And given the way that this term is used in Colossians and Ephesians to refer to these negative rulers, I think it's really important actually to see this as a reference to the positive ruler, the ruler par excellence, the greatest ruler, the ruler of all things. And so I translate it as he is the ruler, and you can sort of italicize the in that. He is the ruler. And the reason why I think this is really helpful too is that then what we get between the two opening lines of each stanza is a parallel. He is the image of the invisible God, modified by the firstborn. And so here we get, he is the ruler, the firstborn from the dead. So that in each case, firstborn carries that regal connotation and modifies further the phrase that was said at the opening line of each stanza. He is the image. He is the ruler. So most translations go with beginning. I don't think that that's the best. I think we should understand it as the ruler. And then again, firstborn is modifying a regal thought in the first line of each stanza. And what I think makes this point even more strengthened is the explanation. The firstborn from the dead, so that in everything he might be preeminent. This language of preeminence is about supremacy. It's about authority. It's about primacy, right? That idea, I think, of being preeminent as a further explanation of being the ruler and the firstborn of from the dead is, I think, pretty convincing. But I don't see translations changing anytime soon either. But let me notice this language of firstborn from the dead. So he's the firstborn over creation. He created all things. And then he is the firstborn from the dead. Okay. This idea of his rule, extends over the living and the dead, right? So that as the language goes on to explain, that in everything he might be preeminent, so that there is no sphere outside of his influence and authority, right? He created all things. He rose from the dead. He's this primary regal figure over all spheres of life: creation, redemption, new creation, everything. He's the supreme ruler of everything, right? So we get some more explanation of this. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Some nice kind of temple theology there. And through him, and this is what I want to focus on now, and through him to reconcile, we got to ask, what does it mean to reconcile? To reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace. We also need to talk about what does that mean, to make peace, by the blood of his cross. Now, this language of reconciliation and making peace, right, through the cross, at first glance, it may seem to suggest a kind of universal salvation, right? That all things are in purview here, and so that all things are reconciled and peace is made with them in the same way. And I think that idea of in the same way is really the problem here. The idea of reconciliation and making peace is not necessarily to be understood positively, and especially not to be understood positively in every situation. So, for example, Caesar was known as somebody who made peace. He brought the peace of Rome, the Pax Romana. That does not mean that everybody was happy with him. It means that some people were subjugated by him. Making peace is actually a way to refer to pacifying in some instances. To pacify your enemies by defeating them, you could say that you have made peace because you have pacified them. You have defeated them. So there is now peace. Right. So this idea of making peace, we shouldn't necessarily see it as positive and salvific. I think it doesn't apply equally to all things. He makes peace with everything, but that doesn't mean that it's going to sort of manifest itself in the same way. And it says that he does this through the blood of his cross. So I thought the cross was supposed to be, the means of salvation for everybody. So how does that exactly work? Well, I think we get a great explanation in chapter 2, verses 14 to 15. So it talks about how he erased the record that stood against us with its legal demands, okay? And then he set it aside, nailing it to the cross. Now look at verse 15. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public example of them, triumphing over them in it. Now that's really, really significant, right? What is paradoxically, the case is true, that you look at the cross and you don't see victory, but what Paul is saying is that there was victory, that he defeated his enemies on the cross. He disarmed them, and he made a public spectacle of them. Right? The idea is that he embarrassed them. And the language of triumphing over them is really, really fascinating. This is an allusion to the Roman triumph. So when Rome would defeat her enemies, what they would do is they would have this great procession through the city, through the streets, and they would have all the spoils of war on display, and they would have all of the prisoners of war sort of just being publicly and in a very humiliating way just sort of brought through in this procession, in a kind of parade. And they would create these arches to sort of commemorate these events. And so this is a clear allusion to a Roman practice of triumphing over and embarrassing one's enemies as a way of showing the might and look at all these great things that we are now bringing into Rome because we have destroyed our enemies. So this language, right? It's paradoxical and everything. But when we see it in the hymn, this idea of making peace through the cross, this is, stated, I would say, elsewhere in terms of disarming and making a public spectacle and triumphing over. So making peace doesn't mean making an offer of salvation to these authorities and rulers. It means defeating them. And that's I think, an important thing to recognize. So all that to say, there are many reasons, in my view, to see the hymn as pointing to a regal figure, as extolling a regal figure. I think the context bears this out. I think the key terms and phrases in the passage bear this out. Like I said, most scholars go with the wisdom approach, but that's not been persuasive to me, and I offer it to you guys as something to think about. There are a few other things in Colossians to note that highlight regality. For example, in chapter 3, verse 1, it referenced the fact that Christ is seated at the right hand. Very clear regal term. And in chapter 4, Paul talks about the co-workers that he has in the kingdom. And Paul doesn't use the language of kingdom very often, so it's intriguing that he would use it again here in chapter 4, co-workers in the kingdom. But the last thing I want to mention is in Colossians 3, verse 15. Paul writes, "Let the peace of Christ rule in you, ... Let the peace of Christ rule." The language of rule, obviously significant in light of some of these regal themes, but I would suggest this language of the peace of Christ, right? It seems, I think, a very, very clear sort of allusion to the Pax Romana. And we've already seen that language of triumphing over the rulers and authorities as being an allusion to the Roman triumph. And so, all of these things sort of coalesce, in my view, to suggest that we really ought to see the Colossian Christ hymn as pointing to a regal figure and extolling a regal figure. So bringing us up to the present in terms of how has this proposal been evaluated? Well, one commentator in a recent commentary, because I published the article in 2011. One recent commentary, notes that it's an option, that this is an option, and so that's there, which is nice. When I first wanted to publish this article, I went to a conference in Atlanta in 2010 in November, and Michael Bird from Australia, now at Ridley College, former colleague of mine and friend. At the time, I had not met him, and I said, "Hey, I have an article for your journal, the Journal of the Study of Paul and His Letters. I'd like you to consider." And he said, "Well, it's got to be really good." And that just made me so nervous, and I thought, "Oh, I don't know if it's really good, so I'll send it somewhere else." So fast forwarding, he wrote a commentary on Colossians, and he later stated on his blog that he wouldn't change his view on the wisdom stuff, but he wished that he could rewrite some stuff and incorporate some of my arguments, which I thought was really nice. And I thought it was sort of funny in the light of the fact that I felt like he actually wouldn't have liked it initially, because I was scared and I didn't want to submit the article to him after he said it's got to be good. That made me concerned. At the same conference, I went up to Gordon Fee, and I briefly mentioned some of my arguments. I don't think wisdom really fits the background, and I think it's more regal. And I was so pleased when he said, "Yeah, that idea about wisdom is just hogwash." I did not expect such strong language and agreement, but I was very pleased. And Gordon Fee actually is quite adamant that he also would say that wisdom doesn't appear to be a very helpful way to understand the passage. So I've been happy to find that in the literature from him. And then lastly, Joshua Jipp at Trinity, he wrote a book called Christ the King, and in that he has a chapter where he cites my article a few times and argues that and develops what I've said and builds upon it. That this is really about Christ as a supreme regal figure. And so I've been pleased with some of the results since then. And like I said, not really changing people's mind too often, but I still stand by it, and so I want to offer it as a possibility for you guys to consider, and I look forward to hearing some of your thoughts on it. Cheers.